Good evening, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us this evening. My name's Will. I'm from the publisher Darton, Lomond and Todd, responsible for the My Theology series. As you join, can you just make sure that you keep your audio muted? It's the event is set so that audio should be muted automatically as you join, but just in case, please do that. I am just admitting one or two people as numbers climb up, which is great to see. Thanks all so much for coming, joining us this evening. It's going to be a really interesting conversation, I think, between Alister McGrath, the Andreas Idreos Professor of Science and Religion at Oxford University, and Ilia Delio, Josephine C, Connelly Chair in Christian Theology at Villanova University. And it will be chaired by Virginia Moffatt, editor, writer, and former Chief Operating Officer at the Christian think tank Ecclesia. The two books that will form the basis of the discussion are Ilia's book, The Primacy of Love, and that is book number 2 in the My Theology series, which has just been published this last few weeks, and book number 4, Alister's book, which is called Return from a Distant Country. So we are close to getting underway. I'm just admitting one or two more people, and then we'll get started. Okay. I should point out as well that the event is being recorded tonight, so if you don't want to appear on camera, then use the video feature in Zoom to turn off your camera, and that will take care of that. There will be the chance as well to ask questions. There'll be a Q&A session after the discussion, and if you want to ask a question or you have something that comes to mind during the conversation, you can post them in the chat feature. I will pick them up and I will relay them to Virginia, who will then put them to Alister and or Ilia at the end. But I think without further ado, let's get started. So I'm just going to give a brief introduction to My Theology. It's a new series of pocket-sized books published by us, Darton, Lomond and Todd, in which the world's leading Christian thinkers, including Ilia and of course Alister, as well as theologians such as Malcolm Gate, Robert Beckford, Rachel Mann and several others, explain some of the principal tenets of their theological beliefs. The idea behind the series was to find a suitable format for making theology a little more accessible to a wider readership without necessarily dumbing down, so to speak. We feel that, you know, if theology is understanding of God and of faith, then it should be something that everyone can participate in. While published theology is traditionally found in perhaps some more expensive books or written in styles or formats that can sometimes be potentially off-putting to some readers, we've tried to address that potentially with this series. We hope that we've managed to, well, we know we've managed to get together some of the leading thinkers, theological thinkers of our day to contribute. And we hope the series reflects a proper diversity of perspectives and experience as well, that helps demonstrate that theology is a diverse discipline and that it can be done in different ways. So thank you so much for coming again, everyone, this evening. And I am now going to hand over to Virginia Moffatt, and she will begin the introduction.
Hello, thank you for that welcome, Will, and welcome to everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here again this week with Alister and Ilia, and it's been a real privilege to be asked to chair these events because each of these My Theology books, each in their own, is really rich and detailed and accessible, and can get you thinking for hours. So I know tonight's going to be a really interesting conversation following on from last week. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to each of you in turn, and I'm just going to start this week with you, Alister. And my first question is about your theology, My Theology. Can you tell us how your theology was formed? what the key influences, cultural and life experiences you've had that led you to kind of this particular set of beliefs and views.
Well, that's a great question. So thank you very much. And hi, everybody. I'm Alister. And it's really good to talk about this because we subtitled this book, Return from a Distant Country. And of course, you'll all recognize that. It's the parable of the prodigal son. And I used to be an atheist, scientific Marxist. That's the distant country from which I returned. And I returned basically when I was at Oxford University as a student. I began to realize that what I'd thought were certainties as a young man, atheism, Marxism, actually weren't. There were other options available. And I discovered Christianity in a number of ways. But what I discovered about it was it made so much sense of our world. Now, I know there's a lot more to Christianity than making sense of things, but that was how I found my way in. And what I found is that I became very attracted to this idea of thinking about Christianity as a way of making sense of our world. And that, of course, led me to discover C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis and I have one or two things in common. We both atheists who discovered Christianity at Oxford. More importantly, both came from Belfast in Northern Ireland. And he kind of way put me on to theology. I was then a scientist, but reading C.S. Lewis made me feel I want really to be a theologian. So I guess you could say that Lewis was a very important pivotal moment in my life because he made me get excited about theology. So eventually I became a theologian. And in many ways, the key themes in my theology are, first of all, making sense of things. Secondly, Christianity, theology is a way of actually understanding our place in this world and also what our world is all about. So for me, there's a very important link between understanding our world and seeing it as God's creation and therefore respecting it and treating it well. But of course, I've held a number of academic appointments. One of them is as Oxford Professor of Historical Theology. So for me, looking at the history of Christian theology is really important because you can quarry that. There's so much there in Athanasius and Augustine and other people like that. And that really enables us to bring that wisdom into the present. So that's a big theme in my whole theological approach. Then, of course, I'm a scientist who became a theologian, so you wouldn't expect me to avoid the question of how science and faith fit together. So that's a big theme in my theology. My present job at Oxford, in fact, is as the Professor of Science and Religion. So that's very much on my agenda. But I also believe very strongly that theology does public engagement. It has to. It can't just be a private discussion between theologians. It's about dealing with questions the public wants to talk about. And so I became very heavily involved in the debates raised by Richard Dawkins. And so for me, theology is also about equipping you to engage these public debates. Now, obviously, I can say more about all of these things, but in a nutshell, that's kind of way what I think is really important, being resourced by the past, by in effect engaging the present controversies, and also trying to figure out a way of holding, for me, science and faith together, because actually that's very important for me personally, and I know a lot of other people think that's important as well. So
thank you. That's a very lovely introduction. And one of the things about this series is seeing connections between the authors. And immediately as you speak, I see a connection with Malcolm, who we heard from last week, who also had a similar conversion story to yours, and to Robert, who very much sees theology as something to engage with the world. So that's a really great connection. And of course, going over to you, Ilia, the connection you and Alister have is around science, which we'll talk about a bit later. But I'm going to ask you the same question. How has your theology been formed? And what influences and cultural life experiences have been part of that journey?
Right. Well, similar to Alister, I too started as a scientist. My area was neurophysiology. I was in brain and spinal cord research, and I was a hardcore scientist. I really did believe that science would lead us to truth, and that it was the real stuff. I thought religion was rather, light, airy, and fluffy at times, and so rather dismissed it. I guess actually as a doctoral student in pharmacology at New Jersey Medical School, I came across the work of Thomas Merton. I had never heard of him. I never heard of contemplative life. Anyway, I read Merton and I was transformed by him. And I finished my degree. I had a postdoc at Johns Hopkins that I actually gave up to go to a Carmelite monastery because I didn't know of any Trappistine monasteries. So I became a cloistered nun, actually, and I leaped from science into the world of monastic life. And that kind of radical immersion in monastic life, it was very radical, quite honestly. And while I was enamored of religious life, and I still am, I guess I realized that Thomas Merton didn't tell us all about monastic life. It's really tough. So all of this to say is I left the Carmelites and I became a Franciscan. I taught Franciscan theology for a number of years, and all this. So how did I get to theology? Is because as I leapt from science into religion, I was asked to study theology by my community. I never expected to study theology at all, but they needed someone in the community to, who could speak the language of theology, and I agreed to do it. I studied with a wonderful person by the name of Ewart Cousins, who was a very illuminative thinker who could think across the ages, from the patristic era into the Middle Ages, and was a process philosopher as well. So I was introduced to a lot of strains of thought under his mentorship. And then as a Franciscan, I was deeply sort of in love with Francis of Assisi, and that who led me to Bonaventure. So how did I bring this together is because the Franciscans were great, in a sense, good natural philosophers. I mean, they're very observant of the natural world. Francis himself was like a materialist theologian, concrete. The concrete was the experience of God for him. And that whole era of medieval theology really caught me. I think I'm really a postmodern medievalist, truthfully. I loved the High Middle Ages, that close union between the heavens and earth, the macrocosm and the microcosm. And that just led me on a search for what unifies, God and creation in our lives. And so I became involved with the work of Teilhard de Chardin and process theology. And I've been sort of, thinking about these questions ever since. And my prime interest really is probably similar to Alister, the metaphysical question: what holds the whole together, and where are we going with it? And so I thank my community for asking me to study theology, and here I am today. I would have never imagined it, but anyway, here we are.
Yeah, that's lovely, and it's a beautiful leap from the world, the very secular science world, into contemplative theology and then back out again. I'll be interested to hear more from both of you how these things connect. But moving a little bit more into a bit more detail about your theology, as Will mentioned, your book is called The Primacy of Love. Why did you choose that title? And can you please briefly tell us a little bit about the key aspects in your book?
Right. So again, love is a core foundation of Franciscan theology. And again, the 12th and 13th centuries were known as sort of, the age of love. Love, I think that word love in our modern culture has been really reduced and sort of depleted of, in a sense, its richness. That, we're talking about the highest good of all that exists, and God as that absolute center of love. And Bonaventure himself really began to describe in the latter part of his career a metaphysics of love based on Christ the center. And I was, my own research led me into that to some extent. And then actually in reading and reflecting on the work of Teilhard de Chardin, who actually was a closet Franciscan in my view. He should have never joined the Jesuits, but that's another story. Teilhard actually posits that love is the core energy of the universe. And he's saying that not from a theological perspective, actually from a physical perspective. He's saying that there's an energy an irresistible energy of attraction that keeps moving things, pulling them together and moving them forward. And so he speaks about love as that mysterious energy, something that we have yet, to really fully grasp. And I think it's ungraspable. And yet that love energy that he speaks about is very consonant with, from a theological perspective, of God as love. And that, again, that from a Franciscan perspective, or that medieval perspective of love as that which moves the sun and the other stars, to use Dante's phrase. And I do think that I would love, my whole work these days is really trying to reclaim a new metaphysics of love in a scientific age. And the core of my little book is really based on a small poem by the Spanish mystic Raymond Lull. Basically, Lull's poem speaks about everything. Who made us? Love. Why do we exist? For love. Where are we going? To be more in love. And this whole kind of framing of our existence around the centrality of love led me to just a very basic scheme for the book. We're created out of love, we exist in love, and we are oriented toward the fullness of love. And that's basically the outline of the book. All that love entails, I might say. So love is never a feel-good thing, right? That's our modern mistake, that everything's supposed to be positive and uplifting. The height of love, there's two things. One, it entails suffering, right? Love entails a letting go, a level of death. The other is, in my view, love is the highest form of knowledge, which is why your question, science, we uphold science as this primacy of knowledge, of intellectual knowledge. But the medievalists would say, no, the highest knowledge is love. Love itself is a form of knowing. Augustine would say, love is, it takes us, the intellect can take us so far. Love takes us into the heart of things. So love is really the basis of wisdom. And I think if we had an age of renewed wisdom, we might do a little bit better today.
Okay, thank you. No, that is really, really interesting. And again, we will come back to that, I'm sure, a little later on. Alister, you mentioned in your little introduction about where your theology came from, that there are three aspects to the theology you describe from a return from distant country. And I was very interested in all of these, because you talk about the historical, you talk about the science, and you talk about apologetics. Could you just give us a little bit of an explanation about each of those sections of the book, just to kind of give us a bit more detail? Thank you.
Yes, gladly. I mean, the book is broken down into a number of sections, and certainly historical theology, science, and apologetics are very important. And it's not that kind where I have a fragmented view of things. It's really that this is how theology bears on certain questions. I'm someone who likes to use theology. So I'm using theology to engage science. I'm using theology to engage our culture and its debates. And of course, I'm using theology by trying to understand its history and trying to work out what can I learn from its history. And that means that you begin with the assumption that people in the past will have seen things that we can still use today. I think that's a very important point. So for me, it's all about recognizing that you can learn from the past, you can engage with the past. And actually, Ilia has already identified somebody who's very important for me as well, and that's Bonaventure. I'm a scientist who turned a theologian, and of course, Bonaventure has this exquisite attentiveness towards nature and reminds us that actually nature, if you like, is a portal to a vision of God as its creator. So that's really important. So for me, historical theology is very important because you're learning how theology has been done in the past. And you're asking, how can I learn from this? In other words, is there something I'm missing that I can pick up from the past? Or have they seen something that I have failed to see? And maybe I've seen something that they didn't see, but on the whole, it's much more likely that they've seen things I've missed. So if you like, it's not simply learning about history, it's learning from history. So when I read someone like, well, Bonaventure or Anselm or Thomas Aquinas, or you name them, I'm not simply trying to understand them. I think that's very important. I'm trying to say, what can I learn from these guys? And can they help me as I try to think about these same things today? And of course, a major theme for me is the relation between theology and science. And that's partly, as I was saying, because of my own personal background. And for me, there was this massive question: can you be a Christian and a scientist? Do theologians and scientists have any ability to each other? And my answer is they certainly do. And certainly in the book, I map out a number of possibilities which I find helpful. But it does seem to me that that what we have in modern Western culture, and especially in the modern Western academy, is what I would call a fragmentation of knowledge. In other words, that kind of where everything's in silos. There's chemistry here, there's biology here, there's philosophy here, there's poetry there, never talk to each other. And for me, one of the things I'm trying to do is to bring these together in my own thinking. I don't do it very well, but I realize it needs to be done. And so in this book, I talk a lot about my own thinking about the relation of theology and science, partly because that's very interesting anyway, partly because it's very important to me personally, but also it gives us a way of thinking about how we relate our faith and wider issues in general. So that seems to me to be a really important thing for theologians to do, not to lose confidence in their own discipline or their own position, but to say, hey, from here, I can talk to other people. I can have conversations that may enrich them and will certainly enrich me. So for me, that's really very important. But that really leads into apologetics. And the reason I became interested in this was because as someone who thought theology and science need to talk to each other, I soon discovered some people in Oxford who didn't think that theology and science had anything to say to each other. And so in Oxford, I got involved in a private debate with two leading atheist scientists in the early 2000s, a man called Peter Atkins, a physical chemist, and a man called Richard Dawkins, who you all know. And this was about 2001, long before the God delusion began to impact on our culture. And I realized then that there was an urgent need for theologians to be able to deal with the question that people like Peter Atkins and Richard Dawkins were asking. So when the New Atheism arrived in 2006 with books like Daniel Dennett's Breaking the Spell, Richard Dawkins' The God Delusion, I felt it was very important to publicly get into this debate and say, look, A, I think these people may have got Christianity wrong, but B, theology does have some very important things to say in this particular conversation. And so I became involved in that conversation. I have to say, I don't think I did it particularly well, but I like to think I encouraged other people to do it and do it rather better than I did. But I think it is really important as theologians, it's really important not to exist in a silo, isolated from cultural debates, but to feel confident and enabled to actually take part in these debates. I think it's good for theology to show it can do these things. And certainly I think it reassures ordinary Christians and people who think theology might be important that actually this actually has public utility as well as its importance in the academy. So those are some of the thoughts I've had. I have to say, I find theology fascinating, and you can see why, because there's so much you can do with it.
Thank you. And I love that about both your books, that you're really seeing the big picture of the world and you're seeing these connections. And I love the fact that already we're finding that you both love Bonaventure and the love of nature that Bonaventure had. So I'm going to carry on with this kind of thing about history because I found that very interesting in your book. And in your book, you talk about historic theology as a way of learning how things have been to help you do them better in the future. And I think that's really an interesting concept. But I also like the fact that you talk about needing to have the language of the past, but also framing it in the present. So not letting the culture kind of consume us, but recognizing the culture has changed. So where we were 100 years ago is not where we are today, it's not where we're going to be in the future, but people talking 100 years ago had things useful to say, but they need to be framed in a time. So I just wondered if you could talk a little bit more about that, because I think that's a really interesting idea.
Yeah, I'm very glad to. I think one of the things I discovered when really studying theology properly is that a lot of the questions we talk about today have been talked about before. And actually the answers people gave in the past can be fed into our own thinking about this. Now, of course, there are some new questions. I mean, Ilia's raised some very good ones in her book, but a lot of them actually are things that people have thought about before. For example, God and suffering, to give you one very obvious example. And so what I'm saying is, I think we can learn from the past. We can ask, how have people thought about this in the past? And it doesn't mean we simply uncritically repeat that in the present. We may need to do a bit of nuancing, but certainly there's gold in those hills. There's a richness in the tradition which I think we need to respect and benefit from. And that's why I think it's so important to study Christian history, because I'm sure they got things wrong a lot of the time. We can learn from that, but actually there are times where I think they got it right, and we can learn from that as well. So for me, looking at the way in which history, theology has developed in history is very helpful, because in effect it challenges me personally to say, look, can you do better than this? Can you learn from them? If you like, it stops me thinking I'm privileged. It makes me realize I'm part of a long tradition of reflection, and it sets everything in context. I think that's very helpful, because if you read my theology textbooks, or indeed my theology in general, I'm constantly engaging in dialogue with other people who I think are really respectful and important, because I want to move the conversation on. And in many ways, theology is about conversation with the past to engage where we are right now. But listening to the past actually is a very helpful thing to do. I read C.S. Lewis a lot, and his book his essay on reading old books is really good. He says, in effect, it just reminds us that we have resources in the past to engage the present.
Can you just tell us a little bit more about, I'm really glad you engaged with C.S. Lewis, because C.S. Lewis got up last week, so I think he's obviously greatly loved among this group of theologians anyway. But can you tell us a bit more about particular theologians who you think have got something to say for us today that we can just learn from?
Well, I think there are a lot. Let me give you just one. This is Augustine of Hippo, who basically was a major influence in the early 5th century, based in North Africa. He was probably a Berber, that's an indigenous North African. And Augustine is existing at a time when the Roman Empire is collapsing. In other words, civilization is really being shaken to its foundations. And Augustine is able to say, on the basis of my Christian theology, I articulate this way of thinking about life, thinking about faith, thinking about the world, which I think works. In other words, he's able to show how theology gives you hope and stability in a very uncertain and changing situation. And as I read him, I think, my goodness, you speak to us, because, our world is so unstable, things are so uncertain, that we need to hear his wisdom today.
Thank you. And I think that's also a nice connection with Robert's work last week, because Robert's, I don't know if you had a chance to read his book, but Robert's work is very much set as a Black Christian in Britain, looking at how white empire thinking has really damaged Black Christianity. So going back to an indigenous theologian from the past actually shows that what he's talking about is true today, and it was true then. So that's very helpful. Thank you. Going over to you, Ilia. I mean, you too draw on a lot of people. You mentioned a couple of them already. You mentioned Bonaventure. You mentioned Francis, Claire, de Chardin. And I'm assuming that you do agree with Alister about this idea of using the past and playing the future. And I just wondered how you see that using historic theology in your work.
Yeah, a few thoughts here. One, I too was trained as an historical theologian, so I would fully agree that we can learn much from the past. The questions they raised, for example, how they pursued, theological truths, really important. But I think it's also important, in my view, theology is contextual. In other words, there's two things I would say. As Alister was talking, I had a few ideas. One is that this separation between science and religion, in my view, is artificial, because taking science into consideration of doing theology is very consonant with Genesis 1, right? It's about creation. And therefore, the creation story, we just don't lop off God, from the world of nature, but we do that in theology sometimes. And so I think, one of the things is this relationship between science and religion is a Genesis story, and I think if theology is to be credible today, if it is to have anything to say today, it must deal with and grapple with the questions of nature, of philosophy, as science now, tells us about these things. And going back to the question of history, I do think one of the things I like about the figures of the patristic and medieval eras, the great figures, is that they were adventurous thinkers. They did not hesitate to explore the philosophies of their day and grapple with them, whether it's Augustine with Donatism, or, we have Thomas Aquinas with the works of Avicenna and Averroes. And so, we sort of do that today, but what I find is a lot of theologians shy away from really grappling with the insights from quantum physics or evolution itself. And there is a tendency to silo theology today, or kind of just, work out some of our questions on an anthropocentric level. And I think this is unhelpful. And therefore, I would agree that we learn from the past how to raise questions, how to look at the world, but also how do we translate or transform their insights into our own world. We don't live in a Ptolemaic universe. We do live in a Big Bang cosmos. And therefore, we just can't lift, the 13th century and juxtapose it onto the 21st. We can learn from the past, but we also have to be actively engaged in the present. And I fully agree that materialism itself is a dead end. In other words, if materialism is all there is, in terms of reductionism, my brain is my neurons type thing, that does nothing for us, right? That doesn't inspire us. There's a depth dimension to nature itself. And that, I think, is the religious dimension of nature. And therefore, we are lured by questions of passion and desire, as Augustine well knew. And that's the theological dimension. What draws us? What gets us up in the morning? What inspires us? And we're trying to make sense of those questions now in a world that is rapidly complexifying, that is, living in some type of cultural chaos, that is becoming something, And so I think the question of theology and science must be a living question in relation to a living God, a God who is dynamically engaged in our lives. And so I do think the question is not only of relationship, but how, if we don't relate these disciplines, what do we hope for? Where are we going personally and collectively? So I think the relationship between science and religion, while it is an intellectual one, it is an existential one at this point. Unless these two disciplines are really understood together and how they are both influencing the shape of human life, I think we have a very, very questionable future ahead of us. And so, my view is if we can harness something, love is not something that pertains to religion, by the way. Scientists love what they do. They're drawn to it. They're impassioned by their questions. A scientist doesn't, just doesn't arrive at a mathematical formula and say, well, there it is. They're engaged in it. And it's the same type of passion that draws even the religious believer or the religious quest. So I find that argument that, science tells us objective truth and religion just, subjective, ecstatic personalism, passion, rather, it's enervated. It doesn't have, it's vaporous, because anyone who's honest about doing scientific research will know it's a type of spirit, it has its own spiritual dimension to itself. So we need to begin to understand these disciplines in a new way together.
Thank you. And just going back to history, and I want to take us forward to hold that thought for a minute. Of the people you've read, and I want to ask the same question as Alister. Is there one person that's particularly inspired you historically, who you think has something to say really useful for us today?
My work over the last 10 years has really focused on the thought of Teilhard de Chardin. He is he is not well understood on either side of either religion or science. People have a lot of questions about his insights, but he was very prophetic. He was not a theologian. And so one of the problems is reading Teilhard as a theologian because he doesn't have the tools of philosophy to support a structured argument. But he does have profound insights in terms of the relationship between science and religion, and his own trying to create a new integration of these without collapsing one into the other. That, you know, the old adage of Einstein or what, you know, science without religion is lame and religion without science is blind. And Teilhard began to look at these two disciplines as two aspects, in his view, of the same conjugate. Two ways, like glasses, two ways of seeing the world. That, you know, you can't just have one glass, you know, and say you don't see as fully. And so Teilhard has been a key thinker for me, as well as Alfred North Whitehead, again, a philosopher who, again, a lot of critique about his writings, but extremely insightful on trying to reframe philosophy for a world that is now an organism or organic or interconnected, as science now describes. These thinkers in particular have, and a Jesuit who's still alive, Joseph Bracken, is one of my favorite people as well, from the Catholic process side of things, because he's someone who's grappling with trying to reformulate metaphysics for a scientific age.
Thank you. So that kind of brings me to the next area of questioning. You know, we talked about historic theology and how, for both of you, the scientists in your history as well, kind of bring you into your kind of interest in science and theology. And one of the things that whenever I've done stuff with DLT, Will is very good at promotion, and he'll put out Facebook adverts. And every time I see a DLT Facebook advert, you can guarantee, and it happened on this event, you can guarantee that there will be comments in the Facebook page that are all dismissive about what nonsense religion is, what are useless things. I mean, there's very rarely, there'll be a few people who like it, but obviously Facebook will send it to people who perhaps aren't interested in what we're talking about. But this event got that sort of response, and people dismissing how can, you know, that whole idea science and theology have nothing to say to each other, which both you and Alister completely disagree with. But in your book, you're talking about science, you're talking about theology, you're talking about the idea of God is love, and love is in everything, in humans, in science, in nature, in the cosmos. So when people say science and God don't mix, what's our answer to that? And how do you explain this idea that Chardin really beautifully talks about love at the centre of it, and kind of that attraction of quantum physics and the molecules being really at the heart of everything? Can you just explain a bit about that?
Yeah, and what he meant by that, when he said, you know, even on the level of molecules that love exists, he's saying there's this, in his poetic sense, a center-to-center attraction. There's an attractive force, you know, even between the simplest of particles. And that attractive force just continues on through the trajectory of evolution. You know, when we say God is in everything, what we're saying that everything that exists has a basic goodness to it. It exists for something. It is not just random. It's not just inert matter. It's not just, well, we could get rid of this and substitute it for something else. Everything, in a sense, has a role to play in this ongoing creation of life, from the simplest molecules to the most complex person. Love, in a sense, is a unitive concept. You know, when we speak about love, we're speaking about unity, things coming together. And when things come together, there's a creativity that takes place. When things come together, there's a transcendence, right? So things just don't come, if it was just pure materialist science, you know, hydrogen and oxygen come together, well, whippy-do, right? But it creates water, and water is essential for life. And so there's something about love, both in its real sense, the reality of a core energy of goodness, a core center-to-center attraction that creates, that unites, and that unites, creates, and transcends, that marks, in a sense, all of life. It's what, and you know, on another level, love is a core language. It doesn't matter what language you speak or where you are in the world. Every single person knows what love is, whether they have no education or the highest education, because that's how deep and central love is to personhood, to existence itself. As we're learning more about nature today from Peter Wohleben and others, the intelligence of trees, we're probably going to find that, trees fall in love as well, and we think to ourselves, well, that's just silly, we're just, and that's the thing for, this kind of narrow-minded scientific materialist headset, has this idea of what nature is. We tend to grasp it, control it, objectify it, but it's, and in the end, so we have, another thought about a lepton, or a quark. We want to know on a deeper level, so what? That's our big question. So what do we exist for? That's our basic question. And when you speak the language of love, it unites people. It doesn't matter if you can't. And the other thing about love, it's a language that's not of the word. It's a language of the heart. And the other, love does not follow the logic of the intellect. Love follows the logic of the heart. And we have yet to learn the logic of the heart in our over-intellectual world. We put everything on this level of intellectual knowledge, and degrees. When in fact, the highest knowledge is where the heart can see. The person who knows in a deeper sense, who forms their life around this word of love, the person who's willing to express love in their actions. And so love is about beingness. It's about being, that it is sense being for another, that I just don't exist in myself. I exist in and with and for another. So love begins with unity. It does not begin with autonomy. It doesn't, here I am, and if I want to love you, I will. It is rather that as I am conscious of being grounded in love, that I exist already for another. And so, I think there's a lot to be honed here, because as we learn more and more from quantum physics about this very strange stuff we call matter, and it's not just little things bopping around, little atoms bopping around like billiard balls. It is a deeply interconnected world. And it wouldn't, it's not too much of a stretch maybe to say that love may indeed be the gravity, that holds it all together. Love is a form of consciousness, love as that dimension that, in a sense, not only leads us onward, but that always looks forward. So, the old adage, like, love is not looking at one another, it's looking in the same direction. And so scientists and theologians, if we had a metaphysics of love, could look in the same direction without diminishing either of the disciplines, and to realize that each discipline, can offer a deepening of what it means to be alive in this world of ongoing creation.
Thank you. That's a beautiful distillation of the connection between science and theology. And as you said earlier on, Alister, this is also a really important part of your work. One of the things I thought was really interesting that you talked about was how scientific theory used to be very much more kind of, I guess what Ilia's been describing, kind of material, here is something we are going to prove, and it's much more getting to the idea of the best theory from the influence of the facts you pull together, and that actually sees kind of some connections with how we look at theology, of how we shape the world. And you talk a lot about the different ways science and theology can interact. Perhaps you could tell us a little bit more about that?
Yes, I'd be very happy to, because I think Ilia is right that we have a lot of very inadequate ways of thinking about the relation of science and faith. And very often the assumption is, look, these are different and therefore they are incompatible. Well, no, they're just different. And I think we need to be able to say these can talk to each other. They can say some very important things. I mean, for example, I have many scientist friends who think ethics is very, very important, but you can't derive ethics from science. Yet these scientists think it's really important to be ethical. So they have their science, have their ethics, and they, in effect, see these as being different but important areas of their lives. And I find the same thing with science and faith. These are different, but they are not incompatible for that reason. I think it's a very important point to make. I mean, I'm wearing glasses, and you might say, here's a scientific lens, here's a theological lens. When you look through those two lenses, you get stereoscopic vision. You see things in depth. And that, I think, is a really helpful way of thinking about this, because it's not saying it's either science or faith. There are each different ways of approaching our world, and they give you attentiveness in different respects. They allow you to focus on the intricacy of the world, or its deep meaning, or the importance of love and holding all these things together. So I'm trying to say, I think these are very, very important. Certainly, I'd want to argue that we can think of science and faith in very helpful ways. For example, there are different perspectives on reality, or there are different viewing windows into a complex world, or you could say that there are different levels of reality. But I think the main point I was going to make is simply that the old positivist idea of science as simply proving stuff by looking at nature is gone. I mean, we have nowadays the idea of inference to the best explanation, which is saying we have all these observations, we try and figure out what's the best way of making sense of them, but we can't prove that the best way is the right way. And in fact, you can't even be sure sometimes what the best way is. There's a much greater modesty, a much greater uncertainty, and I think that's very, very healthy. But for me as a theologian, that's what theology does. For example, it's saying here are all these biblical ideas. What's the best way of weaving them together? What's the best way of generating a big picture? I think that's really important as a way of thinking about how theology works as well.
Yes, thank you. That's really, really helpful. And I think what you're talking about kind of uncertainty, because I remember being astonished when I went to university, having studied biology for 7 years and thinking I knew how to study biology, and that was I learned a lot of facts, and then I put them in an exam paper. And the very first thing I learned when I went to university was that my tutor had absolutely destroyed a theory that I was told was absolute fact, and that was the first time I realised this science thing is not as exact as concrete as we would like to believe. The other thing that I think is really interesting, we talked about quantum physics. I think Ilia's mentioned it, but a lot of science today also seems to be kind of entering almost into kind of areas of belief and things. Subatomic physics to me. We can't see most of what science is about, seeing the shape of reactions to things that may or may not be there, and draw deductions from them. So do you think there's something of some science that's also a matter of belief as well? Because you're pursuing an idea, but you have no truth about it. You don't know the truth necessarily.
Well, of course you do. I mean, that's exactly right. I mean, a scientist believes that this is the best explanation, believes this is the way things are. That's what the evidence suggests, but very often the evidence merely suggests. I think if we go further than this, if we take the great quantum physicist Max Planck. I mean, in one of his classic books on physics, he says that on the door of the temple of science are written these words: you must have faith. And the point he's trying to make is that the evidence isn't conclusive. It's a judgment. You've got to try and work out what the best explanation is. So I think we do need to be critical of those who present science simply as proving certain things. But for me, I think the really important thing is that science does really help us understand how our world functions. But we need more than that. We need to understand what it means. We understand what we mean. And so, I have the greatest of respect for my medical colleagues because, they're very important. But medicine is very, very good at helping us to function well as human beings at a physical level. But we need a lot more than that. We need to function well mentally, spiritually. All these things are part of the mix. And my worry is that very often science only engages a very narrow slice of what it means to be human. And that's why I think we need to keep talking about questions like existential meaning, or the importance of love, or indeed beauty. Beauty is something that scientists aren't always sure how to handle. But what I'm saying is the bigger picture of our world, than science on its own is able to disclose, and theology really does help with that.
Thank you. And I'm going to just pick up on you mentioned kind of the kind of science medical being quite narrow, and you know, our kind of our existence. And one of the things I think that's kind of a threat and opportunity, because science always brings threats and opportunity, is developments around AI. So I just wanted to quickly ask you, and then I'm going to go direct to Ilia, is how you see the developments of robotics and the increased intelligence and the kind of some of the things that are coming across the horizon of the idea of autonomous systems that might actually outthink us, how that might affect this whole debate of science and theology.
I think that's a very interesting question, and you're quite right. This is an area in which people are thinking more and more about, and it is very important that we talk about these things. And certainly I have friends who will say, well, look, of course, we're going to eliminate personal bias and cognitive limitations by AI. You know, it's going to be wonderful. I'm not so sure, because I've read the research papers that show that when you program machines, very often there's an unconscious bias, very often racial, very often gendered, which means that you are not having a neutral way of programming something, but actually something which has an inbuilt bias. In other words, your personal bias is built in to the machine you're designing, and that means it will replicate your bias. So there's a real concern there. I also want to make a point which Ilia makes very, very clearly in her book, which is that love really, really matters. And actually, there's quite a long way, I think, between AI, you know, which is in fact about rationalization, thinking, and these deeper aspects of humanity, like the ability to be empathetic, the ability to love, the ability to recognize beauty, and the idea to use the imagination, which is so important, we now know, in the natural sciences. So I think there's going to be a very interesting discussion, and I think it's important everyone's involved in that, so we don't have gendered accounts of rationality being regarded as neutral. They're not, and we need to find a way of building that into our thinking on these questions.
Thank you. And over to you, Ilia. How do you see those developments in AI and the interactions? And do you agree with Robert's analysis? Is there anything else you want to add?
Right. Yeah. So this is actually one area that I am working in the area of religion and artificial intelligence. So I've done a bit of thinking over the years on this. And you know, one of my theories, if I can say this, is that, I mean, I wonder, here's my wondering, computer technology and artificial intelligence emerged in the 1950s, and the ecology movement basically emerged in the 1960s. Computer technology has taken off like a gazelle. It's taken off at an exponential leap, and ecology has been like a very slow turtle. And so it has really caused me to reflect, like, what has drawn us so quickly into the world of computer technology. And I came across a saying by a transhumanism. Alister sort of referred to it, big movement at Oxford and elsewhere, you know, that technology will enable us to overcome our biological limits. We can have reverse aging, we can download our brains, you know, and all shall be well. One of the maxims I read was transhumanism will fulfill what religion promises. And that saying, I think it was by Max Moore or someone like this, or Esther Fieter. That saying has caused me to, what do transhumanists hope for? And if you really read what's going on with computer technology, there is a lot of religious impulses built into it. And in some ways, there's some truth to that statement that was thrown out there, that transhumanism will, replace what religion promises. American technology is built on the Judeo-Christian tradition of immortality and happiness. And basically, what some scholars claim is that religion has failed. And it's failed because I do think the lag in keeping science and religion in a fruitful, healthy relationship has, in a sense, landed us in this place where science has basically conquered the spaces that were once occupied by spirit, by angels, by God, the medieval cosmos. And when we begin to collapse space into names and objectify things, we lose the place of mystery. We lose the place of infinite possibilities. And cyberspace really has come to replace the medieval heavens in some, in a very, putting this in a very short, condensed way. And therefore, it's very alluring, and therefore the idea that the possibilities are infinite, what we can become, is much more exciting than what nature has to offer us. And the problem with it is there are no ethical guidelines here. Where are we going with computer technology? And so I do worry about religion just kind of lagging behind and wondering, about how Thomas Aquinas's beautiful synthesis can be, updated, when in fact, we're moving at a very rapid speed into techno-sapien life. And so it's one of the things where I would say the science-religion dialogue is an urgent matter. It's not something that we can just sit with a cup of tea and discuss. This is a critical matter for us, because unless we kind of gain a new sense and understanding of the whole that both science and theology contribute to, I do fear that our lives will be in the hands of geeks, of computer programmers, and whatever they're feeling that day and write into their program, that will be our future. And so it's an important question, and it's an area we should really be engaged in.
I agree. Thank you. That's a really, really kind of slightly terrifying and also interesting area to think ahead, and I think it's something we should as Christians be very much engaged in. Which brings me to my final question, and just before I go to this question, I just wanted to say I've already seen there is one question in the chat, but just to remind you that if you have got some questions, if you put them in the chat, then Will can pass them on to me and I can pass them on to the speakers. So get your questions ready. And I've got my last question for Alister and Ilia. It does flow nicely from what you were just saying, Ilia. So I'm going back to Alister again. And the last section of your book, you're looking at that idea of Christian apologetics, engaging with critics of Christianity, but also engaging with society. So perhaps kind of not necessarily just with Ilia's last question, which I think is a real challenge for us, but how should we as Christians be having these conversations, and how do we make them meaningful, and how do we make them actually break down those spaces so it's less of a kind of them and us, and much more here's an interesting conversation that we can all benefit from?
Well, here are my thoughts. I think that people do want to ask questions about faith. I think these are very often perfectly fair questions, and we do need to find a way of answering them. I think that they are realistic questions, not being defensive, but saying, I think there is an answer, here it is. And it's a way of trying to get a very good conversation going. But I think there's a second point that's perhaps even more important, and that is that very often we are responding to other people's criticisms or concerns and don't really get an opportunity to talk about the difference that faith might make. And so I think we need to find a way of trying to say, well, look, I know you have some worries about this, but actually, let me try and tell you about some of the positives of faith, the difference it makes. It brings meaning, it brings value, it brings love. And it means that actually it's a transvaluation of things. It means that there are certain things that we might once have thought were really important that actually aren't all that important now. We see other things being much more important, like, for example, the ecological crisis and things like that. So I think what I'd want to say is that it is really important to try and find ways of graciously beginning to engage questions our culture wants to ask, but at the same time trying to say there are actually quite good reasons why people are people of faith, because they've seen something that goes way beyond what our present cultural situation is offering, and actually we need something like that. And again, Ilia quotes from Einstein. Einstein is actually very perceptive on this. Science is able to tell us how, if you like, our observations link up with each other, but it doesn't help us in thinking about deep questions of meaning or questions of value. And that's a key point. Very often in the sloganized culture in which we exist, people say, oh, science is good, religion bad, and that's the end of it. We've got to try and show it's not that simple, that actually science isn't able to answer some of these big questions. And sometimes those who say science can can answer them, give us very, very inadequate answers indeed. So I think we need to keep this dialogue going. We need to be receptive, we need to be gracious, but above all, we need to be in there talking about these things.
Thank you. And that's the same question to you, Ilia, to kind of conclude, and then we can go to the audience.
Yeah, I agree with what Alister is saying here. I think, I think theologian and the scientists both have the responsibility today to raise questions that help us see in a broader way. Sometimes our fears, I think what I find a lot is people are gripped by fear that, we're going to become robots, or that, that religion is going to create a war. We have some erroneous ideas about some of these things. I do think as a theologian, I feel a public responsibility to both raise questions and to keep alive a method or a way of probing these questions that inspires faith. I mean, I guess I go back to the Augustinian notion of faith seeks understanding in the way that science seeks understanding. Both disciplines are seeking to know in a deeper way. And I think we have to find that renewed source of exploration. The mind and the heart are exploring to understand in a deeper way, not so that we can fight against one another, but that so we can, in a sense, collate our insights for the deepening of life itself. And so I think, again, two things. I would say not to be afraid to ask questions, to see in a new way. I think this is important both for theologians and for scientists, to raise questions that others are not raising, to help us see in a new way, and then to be daring. I think we're not adventurous enough. We are. I find scientists quite adventurous sometimes, and I find theologians less adventurous. It's like, oh, I don't know if I want to go there, and it's like, go there, go into that, water, that dark water there, and see what's there. So I would like maybe a little bit. I'd like scientists to just kind of step back and take a midday break, and I'd like theologians to rev up and just say, geez, we're going to go for scuba diving, or we're going to go bungee jumping, and do something and see this reality of God, because science knows, really. I mean, any bona fide scientist knows. Now, I'm being colloquial here. We didn't make all this, this didn't come about by just some, spontaneous eruption in a petri dish. There's something so grand here, so awesome, so ineffable. Life is ineffable. And the fact that we would even try to reduce it to words or mathematical formulas, well, lucky us that we can do this, but no way do we even get to the heart of what nature is, what human life is, and what we exist for. And so I think a healthy dose of humility can really be helpful to get out of these little silos of, who's bigger and brighter and better, and really say, here's the beauty of what we're seeing. Here's my questions. Here's how I'm seeing, and here's how we might work together. I think you're on mute.
Sorry, my mute button was suddenly playing up. Thank you so much for both of you. That was a really, really wonderful insight into your thinking, and I love the overlaps you both had and your great ways of working together and great insights. Thank you. So we're now going to move to questions. We've got a few already, and so if you've got any more people in the audience, do please pass them through to Will. The first question is from my good friend Anne Booth, and it's around arts and science. And her question is, can the arts help science and theology talk to each other? Much of what you're saying sounds like poetry to me, and C.S. Lewis has been cited as an influence. What part can story, narrative, music and art play to support this dialogue between science and theology? So I'll go to you, Ilia, and then to Alister.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And I would say the arts have a significant role to play, just as they had in the past. Again, I think we've relegated the arts to some kind of, sometimes second tier sometimes, when in fact, sound, sight, beauty. These are the things that lift us up. They transcend, you know, and I think music can be very expressive of a knowing process. Art itself is in some ways a very intellectual pursuit. You know, it's telling us, you know, a lot of art is telling us about culture. We see ourselves, and, you know, I don't know if we want to throw in, you know, communications here, but I would definitely just say yes to the role of art in enhancing the relationship between science and religion. It's a place where science and religion can come together into an expressed relationship.
Thank you. And Alister, your thoughts on that question?
Yes, I just reached into my bookshelf. I've got Rebecca Elson's collection of poems, which is very, very interesting, A Responsibility to All. Now, Rebecca Elson, unfortunately, is now dead, but she was a very able British astrophysicist, and she found her astrophysics frustrating because she wanted to talk about how our complex universe worked, but also how she felt about being part of it. And she felt that her astrophysics didn't do that second thing at all, so she turned to poetry, because poetry was about enabling her to talk about the universe function and her place within it. I think that's a very important point that Anne's raised. But the second thing I'm going to say is that C.S. Lewis wrote a really interesting essay called Is Theology Poetry? And it's a very interesting essay in many ways, but it's because he explores the interplay between intellectual assent and imaginative enjoyment. In other words, you know, you're saying, my mind tells me this is right, but there's something deeper within me saying it's not just right, it's exciting, it's enjoyable, it's good. You get that buzz from engaging this and feeling this is really deep and significant. And that's a thing I think all of us are trying to find our way towards, not simply engaging or understanding, but actually having this deeper level of affection, engagement, effective engagement. And that's why I think poetry and the art are so important, because actually science just doesn't have the vocabulary, the emotional reach to be able to do just to that. But it's a very important part of the human response to nature. And that's something I think that we need to find a way of bringing back into this discussion.
Thank you both for that. And I just would also like to add that both Malcolm and Robert, who we listened to last week, both talked about art in their work in very different ways. Malcolm as a poet, and then Robert kind of using playwriting and music as ways of expressing God and connecting with people. So it seems to be a common theme of some of the theologians we're talking to. So the next question comes from another friend of mine, John Goodwin. My theologians isn't full of my friends, it's just the first two questions that come from my friends. And John asks this as a question as an Anglican priest: are the mainstream institutional churches and their leadership working hard enough to regain our intellectual credibility as we engage with the public sphere? Well, that's a good question.
Our institutional, can you say that again?
Sorry. Are the mainstream institutional churches and their leaderships working hard enough to gain or regain our intellectual credibility as we engage with the public sphere? So I guess the question is are the churches the churches have been quite damaged, and can they regain this credibility?
I think you know, one of the things I see with institutional religion, it's struggling right now to find a foothold in a very complex, changing world, and I think again part of that struggle is is the way science and religion have really remained at odds with each other. In other words, just separate. And so we could continue on in our theological cathedrals, you know, for so long, but we can no longer, living in an information age as we do, we are culturally embedded. We are faced with the questions of our day, whether or not we want to be. So institutional churches, I think, are grappling on different levels. They're grappling with the type of theology that, you know, needs to endure, or the type of theology that needs to be taught or preached. they're grappling with the cultural questions of race and gender and ecology. And so I find a lot of the difficulty with institutional religion is the internal conflicts that it's undergoing. I do think we're in a massive paradigm shift, quite honestly, that, if we look within a heuristic of axial consciousness, we are moving out of first axial consciousness into second axial consciousness, which actually has been around for now 100 years. But institutional religion is still a first axial construction, so to speak. And so I think trying to get an intellectual, a thoughtful theology alive in institutional church today is rather daunting and difficult. And so I see, quite honestly, it's really, speaking from the Catholic side, it's not a clear-cut, path, let's put it that way. Many conflicts, yeah.
Can relate to that as a Catholic. So Alister, your thoughts on that?
Well, I think the short answer to the question is no, but I'm sure you'd like a longer answer than that. I think there's a real issue here, which is that I think it's a little bit unrealistic for us to expect that bishops and senior church people will have a good understanding of, for example, the relation of science and faith. I mean, I hope they do. I suspect they probably don't, but there are other people. I think one of the things we need to be aware of is that if you don't know about yourself, you find out people who do know and can express this coherently and clearly and engagingly. I think there's a real need to find the equivalents of C.S. Lewis or Dorothy L. Sayers or whoever, who actually can begin to articulate from the standpoint of faith these issues in a way that traverses denominational boundaries, that connects up right across our culture. So I think there's a real need for people who are able to do this, but are not necessarily church leaders. So I think there's a real issue here. And certainly I know that some churches have tried to put on programs in this area, which I know have been very well intentioned, but I'm not always sure that the vision is matched by the actuality. So I'm a little bit concerned about this. I'm not sure we found the right answer to this, but it is a very good and a very fair question.
Thank you. That's an interesting challenge. Maybe, as you say, it's not from the church leaders that we need to get that question answered. The third question is from Ilia McGrath, and it's just something I think we were talking about earlier between us, Alister and Ilia, before we started. And that's a question about technology. And has a smartphone, the powerful and alluring tool that it is, has it rewired us in a spiritual sense? Are we in danger of becoming less contemplative? And is our capacity for reflection being dimmed? So I'll hand over to you on that one, Alister.
Well, I think the answer is yes, that our patterns of attentiveness have been shifted. I mean, I've noticed this myself, that I very easily get distracted. Julian Huxley would say that is the root of the human problem, which we are so easily distracted. I think there is something in that. And I think that as I read medieval spiritual writers, I very often simply feel so jealous because they had so little to distract them. And what I often find myself wondering is how on earth can we create a situation where there are no smartphones demanding our attention, there's no temptation to catch up on family news, there's no pressure, and be able to actually go on retreat away from these things and actually think about deeper things. I think that's the real concern I have. To think about deep things requires time. It requires concentration. And very often the kind of levels of discussion I'm seeing on Facebook or news feeds is actually very shallow. And what worries me is that technology is driving us towards quick, slick, short answers, which are completely superficial and unsatisfactory. But people seem to think it's good enough. And that really worries me, that the habit of thinking in depth is something that's beginning to recede into the distance. So I have no solutions, I'm afraid, but I do see this happening and it does worry me.
Thank you. And Ilia, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I do think I teach a course to undergraduates on technology and the human person. And one of the things, I sometimes threaten them with is I'm going to take their cell phones away. And immediately they go into a catatonic state, like, no, that's not possible. The cell phone is really an exoskeletal self. So the whole shift of human identity from the self, or, the withinness, now to a device is really alarming. But my students will tell me they sleep with their phones and their whole life is on their phone. So if they lose their phone, they lose themselves. And the second thing is that I do think cell phone tech, the cell phone, for all the information it has that seems to unite us, it's actually fragmenting us in some ways, because I can, first of all, it's very self-selective. If I don't want to befriend you, I can just delete you. And so it's all about autonomy and power at the whim of the self. There's no collective authority here. And therefore, I hang around with those groups on my cell phone that I want to be part of. And if I don't want to be part of it, I can just ditch out of it. So there's no sense of commitment. And so I agree with Alister that not only is the thinking shallow, it's in bits. If you can't say it in 35 words or less, it's probably, no one's going to read it. It is rather that there's no sense of collective commitment. And it's very self-willed that if I don't want to be part of this, I'm just going to turn the phone off or delete you or move to another site. And that's actually unhelpful in a world that's really struggling now for ecological sustainability and wholeness and renewal. And we have to really question, where are we going with computer technology and smartphone technology, as pretty soon we won't have phones. The chips will be implanted in us, in our skin, in our clothes, in our eyeglasses. And so I don't see this getting better, actually. I see it getting more dissipated down the road, unless if there's something else, that can help guide what we're doing with this technology, that's a different story. So I talk a little bit about this in my book, Re-Enchanting the Earth, Why AI Needs Religion. So if you want to get some insight, there's some there.
Thank you. That's one to look out. That will help you something I'm thinking about at the moment. My next question is back to a more kind of fundamental concern, and that comes from David Wales. And the question is, surely science and theology are explorations into the truth, so both should work together. Some Christians see science as the enemy of the faith, and some scientists see theology as irrelevant. But surely we can explore without fear as we look and enjoy the truth of who is God. How do we get both sides, where there are sides, to look at the same view together? So Ilia first, and then Alister.
Well, if you've been involved in these discussions, it's not so simple, and therefore we have to find a common ground. And I do think, what is it that bridges science and religion? What is our common ground together? Do we have questions that we can raise, that we can both begin to grapple with, together? There's been so much over the years, so much written, so many conferences, so many committees that I've been on, and yet I see there's been really no progress in this relationship between science and religion. We're having this conversation today in 2021. The same conversation took place in 1988, so in 1978. So I don't see much has changed, and there's something that is stifling. And that's my own thought, is like, what is stifling this relationship from science and religion from developing and growing into something more fruitful, more whole together? And it's not just that scientists, are busy people and feel that they have the truth. I don't think that that's entirely true. There are scientists who are genuinely interested in the questions of faith and religion. And there are, religious people deeply interested in the questions of science. So something's not taking place. And, maybe just saying that maybe we're overly intellectual about pursuing these questions. Not to diminish the intellectual life, but sometimes the intellectual life itself does not really grasp us or grab us into something deeper together. And so we need something, we need a new something. something like a Steve Jobs, we need a new Steve Jobs here to invent something that would pull these two things together. And people would say, wow, like they really not only belong, need to work together, but they actually belong together if we are to have, a fruitful life on this planet Earth. So I have no quick answer to your question, but I do have some reasons why, we need to get on board with this conversation.
Thank you. That was really, really helpful. Alister.
I think there are 2 points that I want to make here, which I think might just help us understand what's going on here. One is that people very often are actually looking for an intellectual excuse to close a discussion down or not to go somewhere. And so in effect, they'll say, well, of course, that's not scientific, end of, that's closed it down. I think what we need to try and do is to say that actually this is defensiveness. People are frightened. They don't want to go here. They're finding, in effect, a rational justification for closing a discussion down because they are frightened where it might lead them. I think that that's quite an important point. There's a lot of fear about in our culture at the moment, and it's fear of going somewhere where you don't want to go, but not wanting to be seen to be irrational. So you're trying to find a rational reason for, in effect, saying, I'm not going any further. But there's something else going on as well, which is there's almost like an exclusive idea of truth. If I'm right, everyone else is wrong. And we've lost sight of this idea that we might have partial insights into a greater truth, that actually maybe science and faith are each right in their own way and on their own terms, but nevertheless each is only giving us part of a bigger picture, and by talking to each other we might be able to see a bigger picture. And that involves intellectual humility, which very few of us have, I'm afraid, but I think it does really point to the importance of having a conversational environment where we can talk about these things in a non-threatened way, willing to see where these things take us. And I'm very pleased to say that sometimes we do find situations where we can do this, but the problem is that in a public domain where antagonism is pitted against dialogue, very often the question is simply who can shout louder. It's not about trying to deepen our understanding, it's rather about trying to score points off each other. So I'm afraid I've become a little bit cynical here, but I do wish things might change, and I just encourage all of us to try and find ways of having these deeper conversations that might actually lead us somewhere, rather than trying to simply neutralize people who we feel threatened by.
Yeah, and I think that kind of links that dialogue links what you were both saying about the kind of limitations sometimes of social media and Facebook and the shortness of questions. It's kind of finding the space to have these kind of deeper conversations. So we've got 2 final questions, and one kind of follows on from this, and then I think that the last one actually kind of is a nice way to end. So the question I want to follow on with is from Jasmine, and she asks, the question is there much difference between science and religion? Some suggest science is better, being able to prove, yet the problem is we know science for our thinking. It's more like the association, not definitely true. Is there any difference, really though, through theology, knowing God exists? Can science be viewed as a religion interpreted by another method? So that was the question got a bit broken up. So basically what she's saying is there much difference? Is science sort of a religion in another way?
Well, they are distinct disciplines. They have their own methods of inquiry. They have their own languages, but they do share one thing, and that's the world. The world that, that we are engaged in, that we're part of. And so I don't, in fact, we wouldn't want to collapse one into the other. That would really actually diminish the breadth of what life is about. And so I think it's really respecting and cherishing the fact that each asks questions that are appropriate to the discipline. Science is constantly probing the questions of how something works. What is it made of? How do we move from X to Y? Theology can ask sometimes similar questions. How do we move from X to Y, for example? But I think the questions of theology of, why does something exist? The questions of going back to the causes of, how did it get here? What do we exist for? What do we exist, what are we doing and where are we going with this? Science can ask science doesn't ask those bigger questions. It can in some way, but really it's really concerned with understanding how things work, so that we can, as we understand, for example, the brain, the very complex organ of the brain, with trillions of neurons, and how does one fire, in this way? And when we understand that question alone, just opens up to other questions that maybe science itself cannot answer. And that's the beauty of it. It's sort of the confluence of disciplines where one is asking a question that raises a question that it cannot be answered by that discipline alone. So maybe it needs the other discipline to add its own insight to it. And that's the beauty. If this relationship could actually be, I would love to see theologians in scientific labs and scientists in theological classrooms, because there are questions that are raised that neither one has a monopoly on the answers. And it's when they open up to each other that we see this conjugate whole forming.
Thank you. That's a really, really wonderful way of understanding that. Alister, do you have any thoughts on that question?
I think Ilia's given a very good answer. I think that she's made the point very clearly that different intellectual approaches use different toolkits. And those toolkits sometimes are very, very good at answering some questions and not others. I think we just need to realize that different sciences and theology use different toolkits, and that means that they are blind to certain questions, but not to others. So science tells us very well how things work, but science is blind to meaning, to value, because those just can't be analyzed scientifically. I think the point I'm going to make simply is that I think everyone agrees we need to find understanding. I think, both science and theology help us in one way, but actually, I think we need more than just understanding. We need wisdom. And actually, wisdom is rather deeper than that. It's about figuring out what to do with this knowledge, acting wisely. And, I think that's why, the spiritual traditions of the Christian faith are so important, because this is all about becoming a wiser person and not just understanding our world, but figuring out how to live within it and make it a better place.
Thank you. That's a really wonderful. Sorry, did you want to say something, Ilia? Sorry.
I would just add to that, imagination. We need to regain a new a sacramental imagination, a scientific imagination, a collective imagination. We have no vision together, and that's the difficulty of siloization, of these, beings in separate camps. What do we see, can we see something together in a new way?
Lovely. Both those were just wonderful answers to that question. So our final question comes from another friend of mine, Bernadette Meaden, who's in the audience tonight. And Bernadette asked a really good question, which I think is a lovely way to end. And it is, do you have a daily prayer routine? And if so, how does it relate to what we've been saying, which bit Bernadette found very fascinating? So Ilia, could you answer that first for us?
Being in religious life now for 35 years, I used to have a very rigorous prayer routine, up early in the morning and spending hours, in the morning and the evening. I have come to really, I think I have so reflected on God over the years that my whole life, I think my life is in a sense a form of prayer. But I think it's important to take time to really pray, to know that we are not alone, that there is an other, that God is with us, and that this God is a God of love, unconditional love. And so I think prayer it also can be helpful for science, because a prayerful awakening to the presence of God leads us to see the world of stuff, of concrete materiality, of trees and leaves and stones and dirt in a new way. The saying of Angela Foligno, as we see, so we love. And I think that saying goes for both theology and science. Even as the scientist awakens, in a contemplative awareness of God's presence, their questions can change because they are looking at, their object of study in a different way. So I think prayer is essential, quite honestly, and prayer that leads to a contemplative awareness of the presence of a living God. a God.
Thank you. That was a great answer, Alister.
Well, my prayer life is very disorganized, I'm afraid. But very often it takes this kind of form. I am walking, maybe through a city, maybe out in the countryside. I'm just struck by its beauty, and then struck by the fact I am here to actually see and appreciate this. And so I always pray, dear God, help me to appreciate this more and try and make this world a better place. So if you like, it's about attentiveness to the beauty, the vastness, the complexity of our world. And here's little me. And the question is, how do I fit into this? And what difference can I make? I may not give very good answers, but I think it's a very helpful starting point.
Thank you so much. That was a wonderful ending from both of you, and just a wonderful evening. Yet again, another rich conversation and very, very fruitful. And I can see from the chat that people really appreciate it. I just wanted to sort of say thank you very much, Alister. Thank you very much, Ilia, for your insights. If you want to get this book, which I really recommend you do, Ilia's, I'll just put up here, is The Primacy of Love, and Alister's is Return from a Distant Country. And I really recommend you getting, because they're good, easy reads, but really, really full, as you can tell from tonight's conversation. And I just wanted to mention that the other ones in the series that have been published that we talked about last week are Robert Beckford's Duffy Conqueror and Malcolm Geet's The Word Within the Words, which were also equally interesting. And I think that the video tonight and the video last night will be available on DLT's website. I also just want to say, because it doesn't often get mentioned, but I do think the covers of these are very beautiful. So hats off to Lee Herlock, who's the designer, who should get a shout, because DLT is always very good at its covers. So thank you so much again, Ilia and Alister. Fascinating to talk to you. Really enjoyed your insights. I'm just going to hand over to Will to wrap us up. Thank you very much, and thanks for your attention tonight.
Yes, that was a privilege to listen to, I thought. Thank you so much, Virginia, for chairing the discussion, and of course to Ilia and Alister for sharing their valuable insight, inspiration and theology this evening. The two other books that are in this, if you like, the first issue of the series Virginia's mentioned by Malcolm Geet and Robert Beckford are available as well. They're available in paperback, pocket size, with French flaps. So here's Ilia's Primacy of Love, just one more time, and Return from a Distant Country, Alister's. There will be more theology as the events at the end of November and in early December, and again they revolve around the next sort of issue of books in the series, and they are a conversation between Rachel Mann and Anne Loades, and that will be followed by another between Guy Consolmagno and Keith Ward, which I imagine will cover some similar ground as this evening. So do keep a lookout for those. I will post information about those on our social media accounts and so forth. Tonight's event will be edited by me in the coming days and made available on YouTube as well. So once that's available, feel free to share and circulate as widely as you feel able, because I think, as Virginia said, judging by the comments in the chat, a lot of people feel that that was a really enriching discussion. So all that remains to say is thank you so much all for joining in, and have a really good evening, and see you all soon.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.